Today is December the 27th. Today, we see how Nehemiah fulfills the vows that Israel have just made to the Lord. As we finish up our reading of the historical portion of the Old Testament today, read Nehemiah chapters 11 through 13. Now in Nehemiah chapters 11 and 12, what we find is that Nehemiah calls on the Israelites who have come with him from Babylon to inhabit the city of Jerusalem. Apparently, as they returned from Babylon, they tended to locate on farms surrounding Jerusalem so they could till the land, make a living for themselves. Nehemiah calls on them to live inside the city of Jerusalem. Much of chapters 11 and 12 name the people who now came to inhabit Jerusalem. At the end of chapter 12, Jerusalem's wall is dedicated and the temple is provided for. Now in chapter 13, Nehemiah looks back at the promises that they made to the Lord in chapters 9 and 10. Now he says we need to obey what we said we were going to do. First, he noticed that merchants continue to sell on the Sabbath. He calls their attention to it, and he asks them to not sell on the Sabbath. They agree, and all Sabbath work is stopped. Then in verse 23, about the same time I realized that some of the men of Judah had married women from other nations. He says, we promised we wouldn't do that. We promised we wouldn't give our children in marriage. We also shouldn't be marrying them. Now, the issue here is not so much a pure bloodline. The issue is more that the women and the men of the nations around them worshipped pagan gods. And when they would marry with them, they, in essence, brought those gods into their homes. If those people would have converted to Judaism, they wouldn't have been considered people of the other nations. In fact, Nehemiah draws Israel's attention to Solomon, and that was exactly Solomon's problem. He married wives from other nations. The issue is not the marriage. The issue is that he built pagan shrines for them to worship their own gods, and the worship of false gods proliferated in Israel. Nehemiah wants to avoid that, so he calls on the people to not marry people who worship foreign gods. In addition, in verse 24, about half their children spoke the language of Ashdod or some other people. They couldn't speak the language of Judah at all. Hebrew was being forgotten. Nehemiah calls their attention to it, and they refocus on the language. Now, it's interesting as we move forward right up to the time of Christ, we see that Israel heavily focuses on the temple. We see that Israel, even though they learn the language of the land, which is Aramaic, when they come to the temple, when they come to their synagogues, they worship in Hebrew. A large part of a child's education was learning Hebrew so he could worship in the synagogue or in the temple. Much of what Israel is doing this time is not focusing on the essence of what God wants from them. He wants them to be righteous people. He wants them to be just people. They focus, however, on the cultus. They focus on the temple, on the sacrifices, on the language. It's not until we come to Jesus that we have someone telling them what God wants is your obedience, not your sacrifices. Like, follow, and subscribe to this devotional on whatever platform you use to listen to it. Email your questions to us at questions@becomehope.com. Tomorrow, we'll finish the book of Psalms.